Hi all and welcome to Slaying the Dragon. Now this is the third video in a series that introduces the Levenfish attack against the black Sicilian Dragon. Now before you see of course the Sicilian Dragon position, and it's this move, f2, f4, that constitutes this Levenfish attack. Well, the idea is that it overprotects the e5 square, and that therefore white is immediately threatening to play the pawn push e4, e5. And in the introductory video we saw what could happen if white was allowed to do that without black moving in between. So in the introductory video we considered the seriousness of the threat, and we saw that if white is allowed to play this move, he is more or less immediately winning. Well, this means that black is facing a serious threat and that he should defend himself accurately with a good sixth move. Now in the second video we looked at a possible sixth move, and it was the natural and probably also most intuitive bishop f8 to g7, which is normally what you expect from a dragon player, right? And even though white is not immediately winning, we saw that he can pose black a number of difficulties when he just pursues his strategy of playing e4, e5. And this has to do with the fact that the bishop from g7 is not immediately overprotecting the e5 square where all the drama is taking place. Okay, so if that is the case, then maybe black should look for other sixth move alternatives, and preferably alternatives that overprotect the e5 square. Well, this brings to mind the move knight b to d7, for instance, but of course also queen c7, and yes, we will look at those variations later on. But in this video I will talk about the main line, which is knight c6. Knight c6 is considered the best defense here. It overprotects the e5 square and develops the knight, of course, counterattacks the knight on d4, etc., etc. Okay, now I want to go through the variations, also referring to a game that I played myself in May of this year, the year 2009, and I was playing the white pieces, and I was playing this Levenfish variation against somebody who played, of course, the dragon against me, but also very obviously somebody who didn't really know what to do when he was faced with the dragon. And already in this position, after my f2, f4, I believe he took about 10 minutes to come up with the correct knight c6. Maybe he just smelled that bishop g7 would not somehow be the most precise move, and that first black should try and defend against the e4, e5 push. So he played knight c6. Now theory continues with knight takes c6, and this is, I suppose, the most logical move, because if knight c6 is overprotecting e5, well, then let's take out that defender of the e5 square immediately by means of knight takes c6. Now, this has the disadvantage that black can recapture with a flank pawn towards the center. And now, of course, he's overprotecting the d5 square, which normally in dragon type positions is a very important and strong square for a white knight, for instance. On the other end, it has the benefit that white can now push e4, e5, we will see that in a minute, and also that the d4 square has become available for white's queen. And in certain situations, this queen can become very harassing there towards black's kingside. Okay, well, the game continued with e4, e5, and again, my opponent took about 10 minutes to try and figure out what he would play here. And I suppose it's not that easy, because I'm attacking your knight. Should you move your knight, or should you first play d takes e5? What's the best, right? And if you move your knight, do you go to g4? Or do you go to d5? Well, maybe that loses a pawn, okay. should I go to d7 then? Yes, but d7, you know, it blocks the defense from the queen to the weak pawn, the possibly weak pawn on d6. And if I move my knight to d7, does he have a trick maybe with this type of pawn sacrifice, you know, e5, e6? We saw in earlier lines that it can be an important weapon for white. So, I suppose my opponent was under some kind of practical pressure here. And after 10 minutes he played the best move, the theory move, knight d7. But first, before we continue with that game, let's have a look at d takes e5, which is also a plausible move, right? Well, maybe it's not that bad, but I suppose that after the exchange here of queens, forcing black to forfeit his right to castle, and the subsequent f takes e5, white's position is more enjoyable to play. Also, we saw in earlier videos that if black plays the exchange d6 takes e5, it means that this pawn appears here, meaning in turn that there will be an open f-file, but also that there will be an open diagonal for these two white pieces. So that's in the advantage of white. And after knight g4, black is attacking the e5 pawn, but white can protect it with bishop f4. And now, for instance, if he tries to attack it again with bishop g7, white has the in-between castles queenside check, and he can follow up with maybe rook e1 to overprotect his pawn on e5 and start chasing the knight towards the edge of the board here. And when that is over, we can say that white's king is feeling more secure than black's king, and I would prefer to play white in that position. So maybe this is why my opponent didn't play d takes e5 here, but opted for knight d7. Now I think I should point out that knight g4 is also playable here. But it's not very easy to see what would happen over the board, because it looks like some kind of an adventure, right? You can't go back to e5, and you can't go back to f6, of course. So probably you're going to end up on h6, but is that what you want? Do you want to have your knight chased around only to end up at the edge of the board? And then what is the future of the knight if it ends up at h6? Well, it appears that the move is playable, but maybe that in all circumstances white has just got a little bit better of it. I suppose white could play bishop e2 here, then you could defend the knight, and then white could chase the knight, and then he would be forced to go to h6. And then maybe white could try e takes d6, you know, threatening queen d4. And after e takes d6, queen d4 would indeed be very strong for white. He would have a very serious advantage, because black is forced to make a concession on the king side. Probably has to move his rook to g8, for instance, and, well, you don't want to do that, right? So after e takes d6, black has to play very accurately, and I suppose there are two good moves. Most plausible one is queen d6, when after bishop f3, attacking the c6 weakness, black maintains the equilibrium with bishop d7. So that would be possible, I suppose. But also after e takes d6, black has the very interesting in-between knight f5. Knight f5, returning the knight into the game, and also not minding about the pawn that has been captured on d6 for the moment. Because if white now continues with his e2, e4, e5, takes d6, takes e7, then he is moving his pawn too many times. And after d takes e7 and queen takes e7, we can see that black has all of a sudden some very nice compensation for the extra pawn. And this has to do with the weakness of the black squares on this Caucasian white's king side. Okay, so that would not be advisable for white, and instead after knight f5, probably the best way to go would be to play bishop f3, attacking that weakness on c6, And now preferably not bishop b7, because then d7 would be a very nice move in between. And in this position, of course, white has the better of it. Just look at that king on d7 and that bishop on b7. They're both either passive or in danger. But probably after bishop f3, bishop d7 would be the better way to protect the pawn on c6. When after castles and e takes d6, I suppose the game is equal. Okay, well, having said that, after e5 and a long thought, my opponent played knight d7 here. And I suggest now that if you're interested in playing the Levenfish attack against the Sicilian Dragon, you take a look at two moves here. There is an important juncture. First, we will take a look at the move that I did not play, and that is queen f3. It is a logical move because it develops the queen with tempo and attacks the weakness on c6. Now let's see how the game could evolve. Queen b6 would be a very natural reply, pressuring b2 and protecting c6. And now, for instance, after the exchange on e6, white could, however, try the in-between bishop d2, making use of the fact that black still cannot let go of the pawn on c6, since after queen takes b2 question mark, he would be losing because of the in-between rook b1, queen a3, and now queen takes c6, and black is in dire straits. There is a problem with the rook in the corner. So, better after bishop d2 is to move the bishop from f8. Now again, the normal dragon bishop move would be bishop g7, but this fails to take into account that there is a weakness, a draft, so to say, over the e-file, and also that it leaves the d6 pawn unprotected. And white can make use of that with knight a4. And now, for instance, after queen c7, he has this check over the e-file, and now black is forced to give up his right to castle, and white can maintain some advantage here after queenside castles, and now something like this, knight b6, knight c3, bishop e6, and h4, just starting an attack on the king side. And likewise, after knight a4 and not queen c7 but maybe queen b7, there is a check on e4 also. And now after king f8, white could also try to go for the weak d6 pawn, which is for the moment not protected by the queen, since the queen is now sitting on b7 instead of c7. And also can maintain some opening advantage here. After queen c7, for instance, castles, rook b8, bishop c3, d5. This attacks the f4 pawn, g6, queen d6, preventing knights coming to c5 in the future, I suppose, and bishop h3, bishop f6. Okay, so, having said that, I suppose we can safely say that, funnily enough, after bishop d2, it's not bishop g7, but it's the somehow counterintuitive bishop e7 that is the best defense here. It shields the king to a check over the e-file, and it also keeps the d6 pawn protected here. Well, in this case, I suppose white can again continue with knight a4, when after queen c7, forcing to give up the long diagonal there, or this, I mean this important b6 g1 Sicilian dragon, that's what I wanted to say. Bishop d3, white can also steer for the kingside castle here, like so. And then after rook a e1, try and conjure up some action maybe in the center or on the kingside. Okay, so that was the discussion of knight d7 and queen f3. So if you want to do some research, I suggest you look at queen f3 here. However, in the game, after knight d7, I played the old and main theory move, which is e takes d6. And I suppose this is the move that also puts the most psychological pressure on black. Because, well, of course, you want to recapture that pawn, right? But if we take a look at the position, it means that we can see that white has 2 pawn islands against black's 3. So this is an indication that any endgame could be slightly favorable to white. And we also see that there is some draft, some openness on the e-file, and that both sides have to look out for checks. But probably that black's king is in more danger over the e-file, since white has the rather safe bishop e2 to always block checks over the e-file. And I don't suppose that black would want to block checks over the e-file with the bishop, because being a dragon player, he wants to put the bishop on g7, right? So there's already a little bit of a psychological problem there. And also he doesn't really like blocking the check with the queen, because then later on, if a white rook emerges on e1, again that queen would be in danger. Okay, now we see one slight disadvantage here also of the Levenfish attack. There is a white pawn on f4, and this means that the white's bishop from c1 is a little bit hampered. But, as played in the game, I played here bishop e3, bringing the bishop to a reasonable enough diagonal, and of course also continuing with my development here. Now, let's see again what kind of predicament or psychological predicament black could be in when he is a dragon player and he is facing the Levenfish attack and doesn't really know what's going on and has to find all the moves for himself. Of course, bishop g7 is not possible because of queen takes d6, right? White created a weakness on d6. Very nice. Okay. So, let's return to the position after bishop e3. Well, I want to put my bishop on g7, but then maybe first I have to protect the pawn on d6. What about queen e7 then? But, as pointed out earlier, there is a lineup of the e-file. It is not very healthy for black, you know, to have king and queen sitting there. And I suppose that, well, white can continue with queen d2. And now black can go severely wrong, and he did in a game Klyavin versus Tal in Latvia 1954. Yes, we are talking about the famous Misha Tal. He played here knight f6, and now with queenside castles Klyavin set a very, very nice trap. Maybe Tal must have thought, well, since the queen is not only protecting d6 but also attacking the bishop on e3, I can now put my dragon bishop on the dragon square with bishop g7, right? But there was a big surprise, because Klyavin now simply sacrificed the bishop on e3 with queen takes d6. And now, well, the proof of the punning was in the eating, but it turned out to be a very poisonous pudding. After queen takes e3, check, and king b1, it turned out that all these pieces were in big trouble. It's very difficult for black to finalize his development here, and of course after a move with the bishop along this diagonal, this rook came into the fray very quickly, and well, basically Tal was just blown off the board here by Klyavin's central attacking strategy. Okay, so also the move queen e7 is not a very healthy one. Maybe, of course, black shouldn't go knight f6 here, but maybe he could go bishop g7 here. But then again, I suppose that after castle's queenside, white has some pressure over the g and e files and has an opening advantage. And again, strangely enough, counterintuitive, the best move here is bishop e7. But this is also the first move that my opponent did not manage to find on his own. And let me just quickly show you how my game went before I finalize the theoretical discussion. My opponent played here knight f6, overprotecting again 2 times now the d6 pawn, but he moves the knight again in the opening, and I just continued my development here with queen d2. And now, yeah, he played bishop g7 here. Maybe still somehow sensing or feeling that he had to continue his development, but of course this bishop g7 is not really in accordance with the knight move to f6, which was designed to probably open up the defense for black's pieces to support the d6 pawn sufficiently, and maybe he should have gone bishop e7 here after all. And now, after my castle's queenside, he somehow he gave up, because he had been investing a lot of time already, and apparently he felt, well, okay, I didn't manage to solve my opening problems of keeping my d6 pawn, but also developing in a proper dragon-like fashion my kingside, and now he decided just to jettison the pawn with castles. But of course this is a mistake, because this is a very healthy free pawn, and later on I also managed to win the c6 pawn and had a winning position. Okay, so, well, let's return then to my bishop e3, where we will pick up the theory, and the best move, as mentioned, is bishop e7 here. Now, if my opponent would have played that, I think I would have just continued with queen d2, when after castles I will castle queenside, and now there are several reasonable moves for black. One of them is, of course, d6, d5, when the weak d6 pawn will help himself. He will solve his own problems by moving one step forward. And I suppose that, well, if black has come this far, he has very reasonable chances of equalizing the game if he has not done so already. Play might continue with bishop e2 with the idea of making use of the opposite side castle's positions, you know, when normally you need to storm your opponent's king position, and he could try for h4, h5. But after rook e8, pressuring 2 important bishops here down the e file, it would probably be not such a good idea to go for h4 immediately, because normally you could do these things because it's not really a bad thing to sacrifice the pawn because it opens up the h file, but in this case after g4, which does threaten, by the way, g5 and an immediate win, black has bishop f6, and it would seem that he has enough protection and also counterplay, because he is somehow sometimes threatening to take here, and he's also coming with this huge pressure down the e file against these white bishops here. So in this case, after bishop e2 and rook e8, I would suggest maybe you don't try to play for the kingside attack, but maybe you just try to play for the pawn structure. See if you can maybe blockade some black squares or exchange some pieces when you have extra chances in an endgame where you only have 2 pawn islands versus black's 3, and maybe you can just pursue a central strategy here with rook he1. Well, I suppose black has equalized, but these positions are interesting for you to examine, because if you know what to do and if you know what's going on, then of course you have the advantage. Okay, this ends the theoretical discussion of the main line, with knight c6 being the best defense on black's 6th move. In subsequent videos we will also look at some other 6th defenses, such as queen b6, queen c7, and knight b d7, etc, etc. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed this Slaying the Dragon video. It was not really slaying this time, because it's just simply the best defense that we showed you, but you need to know it. And also I think it's important for you just to understand that even after knight c6, which is the best move, black is still under some serious psychological pressure if he is a proper dragon player and somehow he just wants to develop his bishop to g7. Black in turn also really needs to understand that that is not really the way to go about it in this position, and that he needs to keep the bishop on e7 in most lines to reach a decent position. Okay, well, I hope you can make use of this fact. Maybe you'd like to try and experiment with the Levenfish attack in your own games. As we've seen in the previous videos, and as we will also see in the subsequent videos, black normally has to travel quite a minefield to reach safe havens. Okay, thank you for watching, and please, until